Bible Answers with Dr. Al Garza.
All right, welcome back to Bible Answers. Today we're going to be discussing something that was sent to me and was asked my opinion or my thought about Dr. James White and Stephen Tassi, the Calvinism debate they had on Romans 9 and soteriology, and how Romans 9 does Romans 9 fit the Calvinist model or interpretation versus how the first century Jew would have understood Paul's writings or what he said regarding Romans 9. And here's the interesting thing. Now, with this, I want to make something clear. Dr. James White is, I consider him a very well versed scholar in the area of Greek New Testament. When it comes to apologetics, he's very well versed in areas of Mormonism and Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, I spent the first 10 to almost 15 years in the area of apologetics. I was out there at the Mormon temples. I was talking to Jehovah's Witnesses out in the streets. I was evangelizing when I was younger out at the community colleges, and everything revolving around the kingdom of the cults and occults. Before YouTube, before all these things, of course, we weren't documenting anything. But in relation to our backgrounds, we have similar backgrounds in regards to apologetics. Of course, I moved away from that and got more into more of the scriptures and understanding the scriptures and studying the scriptures thoroughly. What interests me here is how Dr. White interprets Romans 9 and how he tries to explain it that doesn't fit the scriptural context as a whole. Now, everyone knows that the Bible, when it was being copied, into Greek and being translated, that there were no chapter and verses. They didn't have chapter 1, chapter 2, and all these things in verse 1, verse 2, and all that. So it was one consistent letter. What James White does, and what you're going to see here, is that he goes back to a certain point before Romans 9. He likes to go to Romans 8 in a certain verse and then work his way through there as if that's the full context. And what we're going to find out is, no, it's not. I want to play a clip from Dr. White on this and him explaining, because I don't want to misrepresent him and what he means. But he'll explain how he starts Romans 9. He'll go back to Romans 8. And then we'll kind of stop it. I'll kind of discuss it. And then I want to get to another controversial part of this recording where he actually tries to lay a groundwork for not having to go back to the Old Testament to see how the prophets interpreted, but only rely on Paul. And that's it. So I want to kind of look at this first part here, which I have said, and then we'll move forward a little bit to his second part. So let's kind of hear what he has to say on how we should read Romans 9.
If you have come here to see one side beat up on the other side or vice versa, I hope you're sorely disappointed. Instead, I hope what we have this evening is a focus upon the scriptures, and I hope you brought your Bible because I'd like to turn to the book of Romans. And I do need to establish somewhat of a context. Romans 9 does not exist unto itself. It is the part of a continuation of a presentation by the Apostle Paul. And in chapter 8, he has established what subject it is that he is specifically addressing. We know about what's called the golden chain of redemption.
Okay, so stop it right there. I want to point something out. If you have your Bibles, I would encourage you to go beyond Romans chapter 8, actually go a little further back, and let's go to Romans chapter 7, because he's right. Paul does lay out who he's talking to, who the audience is, who he's focusing on these next few chapters, 8, 9, even 10, and even to 11. And I've heard Dr. White talk about bookends in some of his lectures regarding the John 1 and John chapter 1, the bookends of the deity of the Messiah. But in here, there's what we would call also bookends, what I refer to as the beginning of who he's talking to, and then how he changes to the audience afterward. And this is where most scholars, most Bible teachers, when dealing with Romans 9, fail to first establish in the chapter 7. They don't go here. Calvinists do not go here. Non-Calvinists do not go here, which I'm not sure why, because it actually tells you who Paul is addressing, who he's talking to, and we'll talk about this a little later about the categories of individuals there from the Hebrew Jews or the Hebrew speaking Jews to the Greek speaking Jews to the Gentiles and nations and the proselytes. These are categories: the uncircumcised, circumcised. These are descriptions, and how we kind of ignore them when they're mentioned in Scripture and what's being meant. So look at chapter 7, verse 1. This is interesting because, again, Calvinists and non-Calvinists do not go here first. This tells you who Paul is going to be referring to in the next few chapters moving forward. He says in Romans chapter 7, verse 1, or do you not know, brethren, again, a word that's associated with the Jews, of his own brethren, he says, in the kinsmen of the flesh, for I am speaking to those who know the Torah, that the Torah has jurisdiction over a person as long as he lives. So who's the audience that he's going to start talking to? Going into 7, and then you're going to see us going into 8 and 9. It is those who know the Torah, his brethren, his people, the Jews. We could also include probably even the Hellenistic Jews who read from the Septuagint. Those who know the Torah is who he's addressing. And this does not change. I'm going to create for you the bookends, because from 7, 8, 9, even in 10, if you continue, he's still speaking to the same people. In chapter 11 is where he makes the change to another category of who he's going to speak to. So if you look at verse 7, I'm speaking to you who know the Torah. That is not a Gentile, a goyim, someone from among the nations who is not Jewish or even understand the Torah. What we would say those who are of the world of the nations, they do not know the Torah. So he's telling you right now who he's talking to. And here is where he changes the audience direction again, not until you get to chapter 11. In 11, verse 11, he says, I say then that they did not stumble so as to fall, did they? May it never be. But their transgression, salvation has come to the Gentiles or to the nations, but by their transgression. So in other words, because the Jews have rejected salvation, rejected Yeshua, Jesus as the Messiah, salvation has come to the Gentiles to make them jealous, to make the Jews jealous. Now, if their transgression is riches for the world and their failure is riches for the nations, how much more will their fulfillment be? But I am speaking to you who are Gentiles. Now Paul makes the transition after saying, I'm speaking to you who knew the Torah. Now I'm speaking to you Gentiles, to you who are in the nations. And then he continues on about the grafting in and how all these things, fit together. But from 7 to 11, he's addressing the Jews. Now, how can I prove this? Can I actually prove this? Well, one is verse 1 of chapter 7. But 2 is the language that Paul speaks throughout 8, 9, and 10. The language is often ignored where Paul uses terms like foreknew, adoption as sons, predestination or predestined, brethren. These are terms that are reflected of to the Jews or to the nation of Israel and those within the nation of Israel who have believed in Yeshua Jesus. So let me give you a couple examples, because again, these are not pointed out by even non-Calvinists, which I'm not sure why. But in Romans 8, where Dr. White likes to go to and start, which is completely wrong, he talks about he goes in 8:28, and we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to purpose. For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined. Who did God foreknow or foreknew? Who did he foreknew or foreknow from the past? Who did he call? We know in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, he called the people to himself. He called the people to himself, a nation for himself to bring the Messiah. These people he did foreknow, he did predestine and choose them to be his people. But the word he foreknew, he also predestined is mentioned again in chapter 11. Before he changes to the Gentiles in conversation, he says, I say then, God has not rejected his people, has he? May it never be. For I am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham and of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. Now this is speaking about Israel. Again, whom he foreknew. Same language in Romans 8. It doesn't change. And now Paul is telling you again, speaking to the people of Israel, God's people whom he foreknew, he called and he predestined to be a people. This is regards to salvation. Now, Dr. James White will try to use chapter 8 talking about all believers and that they're all called and predestined and this whole Calvinistic nonsense. It doesn't exist in these chapters. If you start from chapter 7, going to chapter 11, where then Paul starts to address the Gentiles, the nations, he is not speaking about them in the previous chapters. It's impossible, and the language does not allow it. Another term that he uses in chapter 8, Paul uses is the adoption of sons. Now he's speaking about the resurrection and this hope in chapter 8, verses 23 and verses 22 and 23. But he says in 23 towards the end that, and not only this, but also we ourselves having the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, waiting eagerly for adoption as sons, the redemption of our body. Now, that is the resurrection, obviously, but who are the adoption of sons? Are they all believers, or is he specifically pinpointing a specific group, specifically the Jews and the Israelites or the people of Israel? Well, who belongs the adoption of sons? It's interesting that we look at this again because in chapter 9 he says, who are Israelites to whom belong the adoption as sons and the glory and the covenants and the giving of the Torah and the temple services and the promises. So who are the adoption of sons? He just mentioned in 8. Who belongs? The Israelites. To those who belong, the adoption of sons. The Israelites. Now, I don't know how you get any clearer in this. He's not speaking universally to all believers here. Jew, Gentile, and the Hellenistic Jews and the nations. And all. No. He is specifically from chapter 7, verse 1, speaking to those who know the Torah. Those are the Jews. And he continues with the language of adoption of sons, those he foreknew, which he just mentioned. The Israelites, the people of God whom he foreknew, who belong the adoption of sons. This is language that is not associated with the Gentiles or the nations, which he then switches to in chapter 11, verse 11 down, where he does say, now I'm speaking to you, Gentiles, you from among the nations. This is never pointed out. This is never addressed by non-Calvinists, and I'm not sure why, but this tells you who Paul is speaking of. So in Romans 9, if you consistently read what he's saying in relation to what the prophets have said, you'll know that he's speaking of how God formed, called a people of a nation for himself, and that even from among the Gentiles, if you get into Romans 9, 24, 25, and even go beyond that, he clarifies that he's calling, he says, I can do what I want. I can call from among any nation I want a people to be my people. I can use them for honor or dishonor. I can shape and mold them. Even though they've rebelled against me and they have not, I can still use them for my glory, for my purpose. This is not talking soteriologically to individual salvation of how God calls and picks individuals. Far from it. The whole context, even at the end of 9, speaks of the Gentiles and of God's people, Israel, from 27. Well, we quote Hosea for the nations, that God calls people who are not his people from among the nations. And then in 27 of chapter 9, he says, Isaiah cries out concerning Israel, another nation. Though the number of the sons of Israel be like a sand of the sea, it is a remnant that will be saved. For the Lord will execute his word on the earth thoroughly and quickly. So he goes on to talk about that. And then in verse 30, he makes that Israel and Gentile conclusion on this. What shall we say then? That the nations who did not pursue righteousness attained righteousness or acquired a righteousness, even the righteousness which is by faith? Yes, that's exactly what he says. Let me repeat it now. In verse 30, what shall we say then? He says, the Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness attained or acquired righteousness, even the righteousness which is by faith. But Israel, pursuing a Torah of righteousness, did not arrive at Torah. Why? Because they did not pursue it by faith, but they pursued it by works, and that became a stumbling block. So what they're saying is, if you read Acts 13, where you go to Cornelius in Acts 9 and 10, and then 13, where the Gentiles came in, and they were the first time after Cornelius' family and friends, as our circumcised came in, then the Gentiles came in as a group that Paul speaks of, that they attained it by faith. These are Gentiles coming in from pagan backgrounds, and all of a sudden they heard and believed because Paul quotes Isaiah, and they were grafted in, And they're like, wow, they are saved because, and they didn't even have to live by Torah. They didn't have to do anything. They weren't circumcised. So they attained it by faith, not by works or by righteousness. Excuse me. So Romans 9 is not speaking about individual salvation. It's not speaking about all believers in the chapters of 8 and 9. Contrary to what Dr. White said, it does not start in chapter 8. The context as a whole begins in chapter 7. And even remember, there were no chapters and verses. So reading 7:1 tells you the audience, I'm speaking to you who know the Torah. And then he goes to chapter 11, verses 12 and 13. Now I'm speaking to you Gentiles. So now, so obviously the Gentiles weren't included in the conversation prior, where you have adoption of sons who foreknew he justified. He called his people. And even says, these are the Israelites, these are my people, these are the Jews who I called and foreknew, who belong to adoption of the sons, who become into the faith, by faith, of course, in salvation. He even uses the word brethren for them in chapters 8 and 9, referring to the Jews, brethren. This is not speaking about how God selects and picks individuals for salvation. From amongst the Jews, God has called a people whom he predestined from the past as far as being a people, and through them he justified through the Messiah. He justified them, and he glorified them as a people. So there's a remnant of Jews who are saved that God has foreknew, predestined, who belong to adoption of sons, who brings in. Now you can argue that's soteriology, sure, but it's not based on Calvinism theology. It is far from that. One more thing I want to address here is how James White will interpret the Old Testament, say ignore the Old Testament and only go by what Paul says. He says this, and this is very shocking to me because this is bad theology. Let me move forward here. See if we can get to this point. Okay, let me see.
Interpretation. We can't run off to the original text and say, well, it can only mean this. No, it's going to mean love, but Esau hated. So you have two quotations from Genesis 25. One from Genesis 25, one from Malachi chapter 1. And it's the apostle who must give us the interpretation of his use of these texts. He gives us his own apostolic interpretation. We can't run off to the original text and say, well, it can only mean this. No, it's going to mean exactly what the apostle Paul applies it to mean. And so what does he mean when he says in verse 13, just as has been written, Jacob I love, but Esau hated him?
Now let me stop right there. This, to me, is very bad theology. What he's saying, and you can listen to as much as you want on this, is that how Paul interprets the prophets is all we need to focus on, just how Paul is using it. Well, how do you know how Paul is interpreting and using it if you don't go back to what was written by the prophets? Unless you're just going to go by what James White says, and he's going to tell you how Paul interpreted it. Therefore, this is a Calvinist interpretation. But Paul, being a Jew and a Hebrew of Hebrews, study the scriptures, blameless in the Torah, I think we can not just trust Paul being a Jew, but go back to what Paul's interpreting to see how he's using Jeremiah or the prophets or Malachi and any other prophets of the Torah or Moses, any of them. I think we can look and see the context as a whole. So if Paul quotes a portion of a prophet or Moses, I think we can go back if we don't know the Torah, because remember what we just said. It is those who know the Torah that Paul is talking to, okay, in chapter 7, verse 1. So Paul automatically is understanding that you who are reading it, you know the Torah. So when I quote a verse or a passage from the Torah, you'll know what I'm referring to in its context as a whole. I don't have to read you the whole prophet for you to understand. So when Paul quotes a portion of it, he's already understanding that you know what he's referring to in the whole context. So he's going to quote part of it. This is where Dr. White here fails to understand that chapter 7, verse 1, he's speaking. That's why Paul says, I'm speaking to you who know the Torah. Because I'm not going to have to give you a history lesson about the Torah and the prophets. So when I quote Jeremiah, when I quote Malachi, when I quote Isaiah, you know the context. You know what's being said as a whole. And that's where we fail to see. So what James White is completely wrong. I'll tell you this, 99% of all Calvinists that I've talked to and reformers, including what I've seen on the videos, do not know the Torah and the prophets, the Hebrew scriptures. They don't know them. Their foundation is only the Greek New Testament. That's it. And because of things like this, where White says, we don't need to go back to what was originally said. We only need to see what Paul's interpreting it. Well, Paul's assuming that you know the Torah, so he's not going to have to give you a history lesson about the Torah. Now, apparently, Dr. James White here doesn't know that, because in the text of the two in the womb, Isaac and Jacob, Esau and Jacob, that, these were two nations, and it says that in Genesis, and it's emphasized again in the rest of the prophets. Not two individuals chosen as a salvation issue, but as nations, how God is going to choose, how God chooses and chooses a people for himself, and he makes what he wants happen through that nation, who he has chosen, who he's blessed, if they obey him. So what's interesting is that, for Jacob I loved and Esau I hated, he says, you don't need to go back to that. Nah, don't go back and look and see what is meant by that. Just know that Paul is talking about individuals. It blows me away, because chapter 7:1 tells you know what I'm referring to about the Torah and the prophets. So you know what I'm about to tell you about Esau and Jacob. You know that these are two nations that God is, picks one nation over another to bless and to work through for the Messiah and to bring salvation. And he uses this all through, even with going back to Egypt and the Pharaoh and all that, how he allowed Pharaoh to stand and still remain. And he says, but because it's for my glory, I'm not going to kill you instantly. And I'm not going to allow you to release my people too soon. I'll put a strong hand on you to keep your heart hardened. These are things that have not to do with soteriological as far as salvation. And even the vessels of wrath in Jeremiah that he's quoting here is about the nations and how God wants them to repent and come back to him. But they don't, because they have become clay in the potter's hand, become stained and no good. And so he has to reshape into something else. That he has the freedom to do that. But they themselves, in the Hebrew, talks about how they have adopted pagan religions and practices, and they became spoiled in the potter's hand because of that. So he has to redo it. They did it. They became spoiled. So he has to. This is not speaking what Dr. White's going to try and tell you. And again, going back all at the end of Romans 9, it clarifies. So big problems with how he's interpreting in Romans 8 and 9. It doesn't start in Romans 8. It starts in Romans 7, verse 1, the audience, and then changes direction in Romans 11. That's what you need to focus on. Read it for yourself. Understand that he's speaking to the Jews who know the Torah. And therefore, when he's quoting the Old Testament, Paul is anticipating that you know the context of what he's referring to. If you don't know the context, and you're not a Jew and you're reading this, you better go and see what Paul's quoting, and you better look at the context, and don't just go by what Dr. White says here, and we don't need to, or else you're going to get a Calvinistic interpretation, and that's what Dr. White wants. So when he says you don't need to go back only here, well, yeah, if you have a preconceived notion of what you think he's saying here, and you're going to interpret the way you want, then you're interpreting Paul under the Calvinistic lens, then yeah, don't go to Jeremiah, don't go to Malachi, don't go to the prophets or Moses. Forget it. So again, we need to look at this carefully. This is bad, I don't want to say bad theology, but bad exegy. It's not looking enough into the context as a whole of how it was written and who the audience is being addressed and the language involved of the things that Paul clarifies about adoptions of sons who belong to the Israelites and whom he foreknew as people of Israel, whom he foreknew, and the brethren in the chapter 8 of the Jews that he clarifies in chapter 9, and the nations that are formed through 9 all the way down of vessels of wrath and the nations. But even though the Gentiles who are formed for dishonor, God calls from those Gentiles, from those nations, a people for himself, and they pursued it by faith, where the Jews pursued it by works, the righteousness of God. That's soteriology. So God is talking about how he is going to call from his own nation, Israel, and also the nations who are paganistic. In that sense, he can call people for himself. He can do what he wants. It doesn't have to be the Jews and only you guys. He says, look, that was in the old covenant. Now we have the Messiah. It's opened the door. The barrier's been broken. It's all been dropped. I'm going to call from the nations, even the pagan nations, a people for myself. And they're going to pursue it by faith, not by the works of the Torah, which you'd see in Acts 15, the argument of the Council of Jerusalem. So pay attention to this. I hope you got a lot from this. I know I can't really everything break it down, but I want to point out these errors in how Dr. James White does not, and even in non-Calvinist errors who don't go far enough to chapter 7, verse 1, they ignore who the audience is. So I hope this helps. If you have any questions, please, post them here. If you have comments and you disagree with me, fine. I challenge you on chapter 7 on in the language we just talked about. So, and I will challenge, on that topic of who he's talking to, by all means. But it's not saying what a Calvinist would say. The interpretation of Romans 9 has nothing to do with the individual selection of salvation, as Dr. White will present. It has nothing to do with that. And if he wants to argue that, then it doesn't include Gentiles. It does not, because he makes it clear who he's talking to and when he changes his direction of who he's talking to in 12, the chapter 11, verses 12 and 13. So again, I challenge you. You can post it here if you want to have a discussion on it. But this is how it's viewed. So this is not good biblical sound exegete. Very bad. So I hope this did help a little bit. Please like, subscribe, and share this with other people. And again, if you want to have a conversation on this, I'll be glad to discuss with you. But again, this is Bible Answers, and I'm Dr. Al Garza, and have a blessed day.
Bible Answers with Dr. Al Garza.